You know the stories of Al Capone and John Gotti, who by their public fame aroused the anger of the highest echelons of state power, who for this trying to put mobsters in jail by any available means. Black gangsters also had such a precedent. It's about Mr. Untouchable, Leroy Nicky Barnes, whose photo on the cover of the magazine caused genuine anger of U.S. President Jimmy Carter. And I must say, the anger is well deserved, because what president wants to see on the cover of the New York Times one of the main drug lords of the country, who has about 3,000 dealers bringing him millions of dollars? And if you're interested in hearing how a kid from the African American ghetto managed to create one of the largest and most successful drug networks in the history of the United States, then meet Leroy Nicky Barnes on the other side of the law. Leroy Barnes was born October 15, 1933 in New York, namely in Harlem. The atmosphere in the family of little Leroy was far from favorable. Leroy's mother, a modest housewife, all his life suffered beatings and humiliation from the boy's father. His father was not a model family man. He never had a permanent job, and he earned his living by betting, organizing card games, and occasional part-time jobs. Growing up, Leroy referred to his father as a man who always had money for nice clothes and booze, but not one dime to pay rent. Over time, Barnes Sr. became an alcoholic as well, and the beatings he inflicted on his wife became more frequent. Not infrequently got and little Leroy. Therefore, Nicky Barnes preferred to spend all his time on the street, where at the age of 9 he had already broken the law for the first time. Together with a friend, he worked as a shoe shiner, and one day an intoxicated man stopped near him and asked to clean his shoes. After Leroy shined his shoes, the man pulled out a wallet and asked how much he owed. The amount of money in the wallet stunned Leroy so much that instead of answering, he snatched the money out of the hapless customer's hands and ran away. He didn't get far, though. Barnes was confronted by the police, who immediately arrested him. At the same time, Barnes became intimately acquainted with drugs, and this happened at home. While cleaning, little Leroy accidentally came across a bag that contained some powder. Leroy reasoned that his father had taken the bag for safekeeping to make money that way. After thinking about it, the child siphoned off some powder from the bag, which he sold on the street that same day. Strangely enough, his father didn't even notice the loss. That's when Barnes first touched a gun. Harlem was a paradise on earth. Well, perhaps only in his memories, but in reality the situation was different. There were many youth gangs on the streets of the neighborhood, one of which Leroy had joined. His gang often fought with other gangs, and its members enjoyed using homemade firearms. Leroy acquired one, but he didn't have to use it against an enemy gang. Returning home one day, Leroy witnessed another argument between his parents. The conversation turned quite loud, and it was going to turn into a fight. When his father took a swing at his mother, Leroy shouted at him to leave her alone. The father threatened his son, to which he responded to by shooting him. However, because the powder charge was too weak, everyone present was only slightly frightened. Barnes was lucky to have all his fingers intact, and his father only got a scratch on his jacket, which was left by the bullet. After this incident, Barnes decided to leave home and take real revenge on his father. The revenge was aided by his friends in the gang. They knew exactly where Barnes Sr. worked, and one night showed up at his workplace. Leroy's father was working night shifts and alone. At first, the young thugs were going to kill him, but in the end, they limited themselves to threats. Shortly after this incident, Barnes Sr. left the family. But the departure of his father from the family could not change the path on which Leroy went, and he decided to follow a criminal path. True, not always successfully. Barnes, who had already had his first taste of cocaine, together with his friend, decided to rob a drug dealer. Barnes' friend, having visited his house the day before under the pretext of buying drugs, noticed that the dealer was unarmed, and all of his guards consisted of only 2 or 3 people. Armed, the next day the friends went to the drug dealer's address. When they broke into the apartment and demanded money and threatened with weapons, they didn't notice that a whole crowd had formed behind them. The thing is, having run into the apartment, the guys forgot to close the door behind them, and now all the neighbors ran to the noise. Leroy's friend managed to escape through the hallway, and Barnes had to jump out of a window. 3 policemen were standing below. Leroy was lucky, however, and was able to escape from them. Gradually, Leroy became a more and more noticeable figure on his street, but not because of any deeds, but because of his appearance. Unlike his friends, who spent all their money on drugs, Leroy tried to buy expensive and stylish clothes. As it turned out, Leroy Barnes was not the only connoisseur of stylish clothes in the neighborhood. Soon, he was noticed by a local drug dealer, nicknamed Fat Herbie. Herbie not only appreciated Leroy's fashionable clothes, but also his personal qualities. He started using him as a courier, but over time, he began to assign him more responsible tasks. One of the first such assignments was a request to pick up a bag of paid-for heroin in a nearby neighborhood. Barnes was able to handle this assignment, and from that point on, he performed the duties of a courier on a regular basis. The first big money came into Leroy's life, and with it drugs. Leroy could not imagine a day without a dose of heroin, which, to achieve a cooler effect, often mixed with cocaine. The money he earned from Herbie was no longer enough, so Barnes had to steal. He would break into parked cars, hoping to find something of value inside, something he could sell to buy dope. During one of these car break-ins, Leroy was arrested. The court sentenced him to 3.5 years in prison. Of these years, Barnes served only 1.5 years and was able to go free thanks to parole. Barnes also managed to get rid of his addiction in prison. From that moment on, he decided that now he would only deal in selling drugs, but he would not use them. Leroy decided not to get involved with Fat Herbie anymore, and organized a gang of his friends and began to earn money for the first large batch of goods. The company broke into houses and threatened with weapons and demanded all the most valuable things. Barnes was not even afraid of worn clothes. During one of these robberies, he surprised his accomplices by forcing an elderly woman to take off her clothes. He later explained his act by the fact that the victim was wearing very expensive clothes that could be sold at a profit. Gradually, the company acquired the necessary money and then a good car. They also found a regular supplier who sold goods and quality heroin. Barnes preferred to sell only at night. In the mornings, he would divide the heroin into portions, which he would then put into several bags. Barnes would hide these bags in secluded places near where he would set up meetings for his dealers. Barnes tried to keep the heroin in his home for as little time as possible. The business grew quickly, and that's not surprising. As a former addict, Barnes understood exactly what other addicts wanted and gave it to him. He started marking the bags of heroin he sold with black duct tape, which became his mark of quality. And heroin addicts from all over Harlem would try to buy such a bag, because Leroy was not selling a highly diluted product. Barnes no longer sold heroin personally, but instead dealers did it. He even had a bodyguard. However, since Barnes was in no apparent danger, the bodyguard served more of a representational function. His presence signaled the high status of who he guarded. Soon, however, something happened that Barnes tried hard to avoid. Leroy had enough money to surround himself with the toughest bodyguards, but in this situation, even they could hardly help him. He had fallen victim to his wife's tattiness. Leroy's wife, Nita, met her friend with whom she had known since childhood. The girls hadn't seen each other for years, and they talked about their childhood and discussed their personal lives. When the friend found out who Nita had married, she asked her a question. "Is this the same Nicky Barnes? Can he sell me some powder?" Nita, to whom it was no secret what her husband was doing, replied that of course he could. The wife's friend turned out to be a police informant. A few days after that meeting, the police burst into Barnes' apartment and searched it. It was only because Barnes was careful that they didn't find any drugs in the apartment. But circumstantial evidence in the form of a large amount of cash and the tools Barnes used to pack the powder was enough to charge him. Leroy Nicky Barnes was brought back before the court, which sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Barnes was to serve his sentence close to home at the Green Haven Correctional Facility. At the same time, Matthew Madonna, a mafioso from the Lucchesi family, was serving his 20-year sentence, and his meeting with him changed Leroy's life. The 24-year-old Madonna was not some small-time dealer. He was in the business of supplying and selling heroin using a network called the French Connection. Heroin was coming into the United States from all over the world, and one of the largest drug trafficking networks was the French Connection. The network began in the French city of Marseilles. After the war in this port city, criminal masters were the brothers Guarini. In 1947, the brothers were interested in the American intelligence services. Moreover, the secret services needed their help. The fact is that Marseille was gripped by strikes that could disrupt the export of American goods to France. The strike was organized by local communists who opposed the Marshall Plan, a program of economic aid to the countries of Europe. To prevent the disruption of shipments, the CIA was willing to do anything, even allying with local gangsters. The CIA provided the Guarini brothers with everything they needed to fight the strikers, and they quickly brought order to the city. In 1950, the situation was repeated. Striking workers jeopardized supplies for the war in Indochina, and the CIA again turned to the Guarini brothers. The brothers' services to restore order in the port of Marseilles cost the Americans $2 million and several crates of weapons. Having returned the supply line to the Americans, the Guarini brothers themselves began to use the port to receive opium raw materials from Indochina, process them into heroin, and then send them to the United States. Matthew Madonna found himself in prison on a murder charge. Leroy and Matthew had a lot in common. They were nearly the same age. Each had spent their childhoods in New York City, and they hit it off pretty quickly. All their conversations centered around heroin. Leroy would tell Matthew about how hard it was to sell, and Matthew, who had more experience, shared his thoughts on what an ideal organization for the sale would be. Leroy looked at Matthew with admiration. He really liked the family spirit that distinguished the Italians from the other prisoners. He later recalled that a whole group of friends with their children came to visit Matthew, while Leroy himself was never visited in prison. Madonna was interested in Barnes. With his help, he hoped to sell his goods in Harlem. Therefore, shortly before Leroy's release from prison, Madonna offered him cooperation, and Barnes accepted. Matthew's brother Frank provided Leroy with everything he needed. Immediately after his release, Barnes received from him half a kilogram of heroin for sale and $2,000 as a gift. With this money, Barnes was able to buy a car and rent a secluded place in which to set up a stash house. Frank Madonna continued to patronize Leroy and helped him with advice. One day, Barnes had a conflict with another black drug dealer, Steve Austin, who decided he could sell his products on the same streets as Leroy. Barnes was determined and was about to shoot him. Frank, however, managed to dissuade him from such a rash act. Your customers aren't interested in which of you two is the tougher guy. They're only interested in the quality of the product, and you have no problem with that. The Madonna brothers saw Barnes as a long-term investment that it was foolish to lose over some minor turf dispute. Frank advised Barnes to cede his streets to a competitor and move to another neighborhood himself. As for revenue, Leroy didn't have to worry about that. Buyers would find sellers with his product if it was really good. Frank Madonna paid special attention to the safety of his ward. Leroy had to stay as far away from the drugs as possible, ideally without touching them at all. Frank advised Barnes to delegate all the work to his employees and to remain in the shadows, only coordinating their actions. Leroy strictly forbade his subordinates to mention anything related to the business in telephone conversations. He was sure that the phones of his team members could be tapped by police, and as it turns out, he was right. It is not known what exactly attracted the attention of one of Barnes' closest associates, Reggie, but his phone had already been tapped by the police. On January the 29th, 1965, Barnes was arrested while at Reggie's apartment. After the arrest, the police officers went with Barnes to the apartment where the heroin was being packed. A search was conducted there, and the police confiscated $500,000 worth of heroin. Barnes' arrest was the culmination of a lengthy investigation by the Bronx District Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Out on bail, Barnes contacted his attorney. They tried to challenge the legality of the wiretap and arrest, but their efforts were unsuccessful. A jury found Leroy Nicky Barnes guilty of drug possession and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. He was to serve his sentence in the familiar Green Haven prison, the same one he had only left 3 years earlier. In prison, Barnes became friends with local African Americans and even converted to Islam. Leroy also spent a lot of time studying African history. The fact is that in those years, this was a very popular concept, according to which all the world's cultural heritage, including Western, originally appeared in Africa and then was occupied by whites. In fact, Barnes became a supporter of a movement called the Nation of Islam. This is a political and religious movement of African Americans that was founded back in the 1930s. Leroy vowed never to abuse substances again and gave up pork. In those months, Leroy virtually stopped socializing with Matthew Madonna and his entourage. Madonna, still serving his time, was ironic about Leroy and his new hobbies. It's worth noting that although there was always some tension between Italians and African Americans in Green Handway, it never escalated into open confrontation. The parties preferred to simply ignore each other. But there was one Italian in prison who, for some reason, could not communicate with other Italians, and instead he became close to the black prisoners and often stood up for them in front of the puppet clan. His name was Joe Gallo. I have a separate video about him and his brothers on my channel. They are considered the main rebels in the Cosa Nostra and one of the toughest gangs in the history of the American Mafia. In prison, Barnes and Gallo became friends, and there were rumors that Joe was even thinking of becoming a heroin supplier for Barnes, but it's all at the level of rumors. Barnes later recalled conversations with Joe. Most often, they discussed literature with Gallo. Joe loved to read. Among his favorite writers included the French existentialist Sartre and Camus. It was from Joe Leroy learned about the works of the famous Niccolò Machiavelli, which then often and with pleasure quoted. Also, according to one version, it was Joe Gallo who is the man who got Leroy out of prison early. When he found himself at large, he immediately involved in the case of Barnes, his own lawyer, who quickly found numerous procedural violations. According to another version, which Barnes himself adheres to, it was different. There is no mention of any help from Gallo. Instead, Barnes recounts that while perusing criminal law journal articles in their library, he came across an article on Katz versus the United States. Charles Katz was a bookmaker who was being investigated by the FBI. The FBI was particularly interested in his telephone conversations, which the cautious Katz conducted only from a phone booth near his apartment. The FBI installed a listening device in the booth and gained access to his conversations. Katz was soon arrested and charged with a federal crime of transmitting betting information. Katz's attorneys tried to challenge the indictment, appealing that the agents did not have a warrant allowing them to use the listening devices. Thus, the tapes of the conversations in the FBI's possession violate the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires that any search warrants be issued by a court only with probable cause. At first, the defense arguments failed to impress the judge, and Katz was convicted. However, the defense attorneys were able to appeal the conviction, and Katz was released. The judge ruled that the phone booth that Katz was in during the conversations was constitutionally protected territory where Katz was entitled to his privacy. It was this process that Barnes' attorney cited during the retrial. The judge was persuaded by that argument. So Leroy Nicky Barnes was free once again, having served less than 4 years of his 15-year sentence in prison. After leaving prison, Barnes began to create a completely new organization. There's a version that it was conversations with Joe Gallo that prompted him to do so, but again, these were all rumors. Barnes chose Italian crime families as his role models. On the streets of Harlem, now there was no place for disparate gangs that feuded with each other. In their place was to appear a huge cooperation, with its own strict laws and rules. Barnes always remembered that he had once been a heroin addict himself. He believed that because of this experience, he knew better what kind of goods the customers on the street wanted. This is why he tried to recruit helpers from former drug addicts. The leadership of the organization, called the Council, consisted of 7 people: Barnes, Joseph Hayden, Wallace Rice, Thomas Foreman, Ismail Muhammad, Frank James, and Guy Fisher. Half of that list are former addicts, who were able to find the strength to rise from the bottom. The council was still buying from the Italians. Madonna's accomplices would leave a car with a trunk full of heroin in a Manhattan parking lot, and a few days later pick it up with a trunk full of cash. The trunk held about 100 kilograms of heroin, which cost Barnes about $2.5 million. At first, Barnes would get the goods on loan, which he was supposed to pay back in a month. The heroin was then taken to one of Barnes' rented apartments, where hired women packaged the entire product into 141,000 portions. It took them about 2 days to make the 141,000 servings, followed by another 24 hours of thorough cleaning of the apartment. Barnes spared no expense. Each of the packers, as a reward for their labor, received $15,000. One portion of heroin was equal to the so-called New York quarter, and the volume of heroin was approximately equal to a large tablespoon. Cost of such a portion reached about $70, and the final revenue for all realized goods reached about $10 million. Barnes' goods were especially popular with small street vendors. Knowing the great quality of his heroin, dealers broke a quarter of it into smaller doses, which were then diluted. But even this diluted product was bought up by customers quickly. The entire city was divided among the council members. Thus, Guy Fisher got the South Bronx, Ismail Muhammad, Frank James, and Wallace Rice all got the East Side. Barnes himself, along with Joseph Hayden, sold merchandise in his native Harlem. Each member of the board had an alternate, who in turn supervised a dozen mid-level dealers. Each of these dealers managed no less than 40 street vendors. If you tried to roughly count everyone involved in the process, the figure would run to several thousand people. The council was making fantastic profits. In the summer of 1973, Barnes even set a record. After the sale of a batch of goods in 200 kilograms, the council received a profit of $20 million. Soon, Barnes' business outgrew New York City. His product was so good that dealers from Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Oakland came for it. And in 1976, he could rightly call his council an international company because his heroin was even being sold in Canada. Barnes led a bohemian lifestyle and visited the best nightclubs in the city. He remained faithful to the precepts of his youth and always tried to dress expensively and flashy. His suits were sewn only to order. His closet totaled 300 suits, 50 leather coats, and about 100 pairs of shoes. Barnes also had a special passion for expensive cars. In his garage were a Bentley, a Citroen SM, a Maserati, and a Mercedes-Benz 300 SEL, several Cadillacs, and even a yellow Volvo. Barnes realized that such a fleet of cars would sooner or later attract the attention of the tax authorities, so he took care of his cover. He created a whole network of fictitious companies that supposedly leased him cars on a long-term basis. Barnes also did not forget about charity. Since 1974, in New York, they began to hold the so-called Harlem Weeks. These are annual events designed to acquaint New Yorkers with the culture of black neighborhoods. Barnes helped orphans and single mothers, distributed turkeys on Thanksgiving, and gave free gifts to children on Christmas Eve. That this ostensible prosperity was made possible by turning Harlem into a ghetto, no one tried to remember. In 4 years, from 1970 to 1974, the number of heroin addicts in the country doubled, and Harlem was the most vivid illustration of these statistics. However, Barnes himself later treated it philosophically. Yes, I filled the streets of the city with powder, but if I hadn't done it, someone else would have, whether it was an Italian or a Latino, and you can be sure that none of them would have ever given one dime back to Harlem. During that period, drugs became the talk of the nation's top leaders. In 1971, President Richard Nixon said at a White House briefing that drug addiction was public enemy number one in the United States, and to fight and defeat this enemy, an all-out offensive was necessary. However, the New York State government did not know how to go on that offensive. The only thing the state's then governor, Nelson Rockefeller, could offer was the toughest anti-drug laws in the country. The sale of 2 ounces of heroin, cocaine, morphine, opium, or marijuana was punishable by imprisonment from 15 to 25 years. Possession of 4 ounces or more was punishable by the same penalty. This heavy-handed policy was ineffective and could not stop the growing number of drug addicts. Barnes laughed heartily at these actions of the authorities. He believed that the solution to the problem of drug trafficking in New York should have started with the arrest of all the detectives from the Special Investigations Division. According to him, all the dealers in New York knew that these guys were drug dealers themselves. Barnes was not so far from the truth. In 1972, all of New York City was discussing an incident that occurred at a police warehouse of confiscated goods and evidence. The police department decided to make an inventory of seized drugs. However, the suitcases, which had been seized back in 1962 during the French Connection investigation, contained flour and starch instead of drugs. Who and when the drugs were stolen was never found out, and the only suspect, New York City police detective Joseph Nzita, was found dead in his own car. The official version of his death is believed to be suicide, although rumors immediately spread around the city that Nzita had been shot. The governor of the state, trying to calm the public, came up with nothing better than to tighten the existing law. From now on, all dealers caught red-handed were sent to life imprisonment without the right of parole. However, this measure seemed excessive to many. Thus, the mayor of New York, John Lindsay, called the governor's law vindictive. Ordinary residents of New York, and especially Harlem, called it a conspiracy against the little people who could not stand up for themselves. The authorities realized that they could calm the public only if they could arrest a high-ranking drug trafficker. They had to prove that the law was not only directed against small sellers who could find a couple of ounces in their pockets, but also against the real sharks of the drug business. The authorities then called on the press to help. A few days after the Rockefeller Act was passed, on January the 8th, 1973, the New Yorker magazine published an article about Barnes entitled Untouchables, 11 top names in the city's drug trade. Barnes later joked sadly about the article. New Yorkers are willing to pay good money to have their pictures printed in the paper, but we were published for free. Other journalists tried to keep up and also added fuel to the fire. The headlines were eloquent. Nicky Barnes has a black mafia. The press had made up many falsehoods about Barnes before. Some newspapermen wrote that he was a member of the Symbionese Liberation Army, a left-wing terrorist organization that had been noted for several bank robberies and murders. Barnes didn't care about the fictions of the newspapers. He believed that he enjoyed such attention from the press because of his photogenic. Newspapers are interested in selling circulation, and the best way to increase its circulation is to put on the cover of the photo of Nicky Barnes in a luxurious suit. No one is going to buy a newspaper with Jose Rosa looking at the reader from the cover. Rosa was a major drug dealer in the Hispanic section of Harlem and, according to Barnes, the owner of the most disgusting face. The Rockefeller Act was effective as of September the 1st of 1973. The New York Police Department decided to give Barnes a little surprise on this occasion. On August the 29th, Nicky returned to New York from Detroit, where he was meeting with a lawyer he knew. At the airport, Nicky was supposed to meet his wife, but she was not there. Alarmed, Barnes called home, and his wife told him there was no electricity in the area and the elevator in the house does not work, and to go down the stairs in the dark with a 1-year-old child in her hands, she wasn't going to do. Barnes reassured his wife with the phrase, "Stay calm, honey. I'll take a cab and I'll see you home soon." Barnes arrived home and, after reassuring his wife, left on business. When Barnes arrived back the next day, he was met by a group of 15 police officers near the entrance to his 13th floor apartment. They handcuffed him and proceeded to his apartment. Perhaps the lawmen expected to see a huge drug lab, but instead they saw Barnes' terrified wife, who was nursing her daughter. The cops searched the apartment, but instead of a ton of heroin, they found only $50,000 in cash and a few guns. Barnes once again became agitated when a policeman came out of his bedroom carrying a leather travel bag. Nicky was sure the policeman had put a couple of kilos of pre-prepared drugs in it, but to his surprise, only documents and dirty clothes were found in it. The agent's loot wasn't much. The sniffer dogs were only able to find one butt of a marijuana joint that Barnes had accidentally left in his bathroom. While Barnes was in Detroit, Police thought he had fled to the Caribbean islands, hoping to wait out Rockefeller's law there. They had been tapping Barnes' phone for some time at home, and the phrase he said to his wife, "Stay calm, honey," they recognized it as some kind of code. When police from a surveillance team outside Barnes' home reported that Barnes had gotten out of a cab with a large leather bag, suspicions were heightened. After questioning the terrified cabbie and learning that he had picked up his last passenger near the airport, the cops decided they were lucky. In those years, airport security wasn't very strict, so couriers often carried drugs in their hand luggage. The imagination of the police imagined a bag full of kilograms of heroin from France or Vietnam, and all their doubts were finally dispelled when they saw Barnes walking home. Since the house had no electricity, Barnes had to run up 13 flights of stairs. Connecting the non-working elevator and the lack of electricity in the home provided to be an impossible task for the police officers. They decided that Nicky had decided to run the 13 floors on foot, fearing an ambush at the elevator doors. Based on these observations, the judge granted police officers a search warrant. In his book, Nicky Barnes openly mocks police. He sees the search as a desperate attempt to find anything to justify 8 months of a fruitless investigation. The cops, in his opinion, spent too much time and money and therefore had to somehow prove to their superiors that they were worthy of their job. Barnes recounts he was accompanied at all times by outside surveillance, tracking his movements around the city. His phone records were tapped. He had a car full of agents parked across the street from his home 24 hours a day, and that's not to mention a whole network of street-level informants. But all that effort was ultimately in vain. That Barnes' version, though, the more plausible version, is that the cops did this search without the hope of finding anything compromising in Nicky's apartment. It was a signal that should have made Barnes realize that times had changed and he would no longer be able to conduct his affairs as easily as before. Nicky Barnes tried not to think about lawmen or the Rockefeller law. He didn't take the cops seriously. At the time, Barnes was much more concerned with money laundering. As he himself claimed, if you drive a Maserati, own several penthouses, and report an income of only $30,000 a year, don't be surprised if the IRS takes an interest in you. Barnes clearly didn't want to repeat Al Capone's fate. Barnes, thanks to his lawyer, was able to find a way to make the tax system work for him instead of against him. In America, there was and still is an association, FHA, or Federal Housing Administration. This organization was founded by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to ensure mortgage loans. FHA provides access to affordable mortgages for low and middle income people. So Barnes decided to invest the drug money in FHA projects, for example, in the construction of residential apartment complexes. He could launder as much as millions through this organization. What's more, he was entitled to a half tax abatement during construction. Nicky enjoyed fantasizing about where he could invest his money once it was clean. In his book, Barnes wrote that his dream was to build a huge shopping mall in Harlem and create a nationwide network of automated car washes. Such an investment would instantly transform Nicky Barnes from a drug dealer into a respectable businessman. Another problem was the large amount of cash on hand. Barnes found a solution here as well. The rector of the local church, which Barnes often attended with his wife, helped him. He would take the money and store it in the church's endowment fund. This service cost Nicky 2% of the amount. Quite a lot, but in those cases where bail was required, neither the judge nor the prosecutor had any questions about the origin of the money. The reputation of the church was not questioned. Sometimes, however, even those tricks didn't work. On May the 11th, 1974, Nicky Barnes was arrested by police on suspicion of murder. The judge set bail at $100,000. The rector of the church brought the full amount the next day, but the Bronx District Attorney, Mario Merola, rejected it. He also convinced the judge to hold a hearing on where the poor parish would get such a huge sum of money. The rector's explanation did not convince the prosecution, as the church had only $330 in its account at the time of Barnes' arrest. Bail was denied. Attempts to get Nicky out from behind bars continued for almost 2 months until his attorney brought the necessary amount, explaining that the money was part of Barnes' real estate investment. Mr. Untouchable found himself free, but the press discussed the episode for a long time. It wasn't the first accusation against Barnes, but it was the one that nearly destroyed his entire empire. Journalists didn't just write about Nicky Barnes, they made him a star. Every reader now knew him by sight, and so it was too risky to resume face-to-face meetings with Madonna. Anticipating this development, Barnes introduced Matthew to Guy Fisher. However, their relationship did not go well from the beginning. According to Madonna, Fisher did not show up to give him the proper respect. On top of all this, there was another unpleasant episode for Fisher. Guy had a conflict with 2 of his small-time dealers. They were arrested by police and had to hand over the proceeds and the rest of their merchandise. Guy considered this an insult and shot them both dead. Council members considered murder to be the most extreme measure that could be taken. The decision to kill someone was always made collectively, and that decision had to be unanimous. Gaius decided to disregard these formalities and carried out the most ordinary lynching. In response to the outrage of Barnes and the others, he declared that since those dealers were his subordinates, he alone had the right to decide what to do with them. Fisher was increasingly in trouble. On September the 30th of 1974, he went to meet with Matthew Madonna, who was to give him the keys to a car loaded with heroin. He had $100,000 in cash with him. On the way, Guy committed a traffic violation and was stopped by police. During the ID check, Guy gave the cops his fake driver's license, after which they decided to search the car. When they saw a bag of cash in the trunk, Guy offered to take the money and let him go. Guy Fisher was instantly arrested and charged with attempted bribery. The money was confiscated and Barnes had to splurge. He bailed Fisher out and paid off Madonna. However, when Fisher paid Barnes back for his bail, he paid $5,000 less. Nicky later recalled that it was at this point that he had some doubts about Fisher, but he didn't give them much thought at the time. Guy Fisher, too, dreamed of becoming a legitimate businessman, but he thought differently from Barnes. If Nicky was looking for real and workable options, Fisher caught fire with the idea of buying the Apollo Theater. This concert hall in the early 20th century played an important role in the history of African American music, but in the 70s, it languished due to a fairly miserable existence. Fisher believed that buying the Apollo would make their business more respectable. The theater was up for auction for only $500,000 and in addition had great tax benefits as a historic landmark. And while the council was preparing for the purchase, another unfortunate incident occurred. In 1976, they had lost their supplier in the person of Matthew Madonna. Now they needed to urgently find a new supplier of goods. One of the board members praised the merchandise of a Mexican dealer, Benito Cortina. Barnes spent $250,000 to buy the first shipment, but he was not impressed with the quality of the heroin. Unlike Madonna's Snow White heroin from Marcellus, the product from Mexico was dark brown and resembled dirt. But there were no other options, and he had to buy it. Then Barnes' underlings spent a good deal of time turning those brown lumps into white powder. At the same time, the trial of Guy Fisher took place. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison for the incident in which he offered to bribe police officers. After Fisher's trial, Barnes' trial also began. A full 3 years had passed since the search of Nicky's apartment, but the prosecution still managed to bring the case to trial. Barnes was tried before a Manhattan jury. The protagonists of the trial were police sniffer dogs. According to prosecutors, the dogs sniffed Barnes' cars in the garage and made barking noises indicating that the trunk had recently contained drugs. The dogs made the same barking noise when Nicky's apartment was searched. In the prosecutor's view, this clearly indicated that drugs were stored in the car and in the apartment. Eager to convince the jury, the prosecutors brought 2 boxes into the room, one of which contained heroin. When the dogs approached this box, they began barking. Barnes' attorney asked to remove those boxes from the courtroom and then brought his own. When he placed his box in front of the dogs, they began barking fiercely. The lawyer hastened to show those present its contents. The box contained aspirin. A few hours later, Barnes dined with a lawyer at an Italian restaurant. Mr. Untouchable had once again confirmed his nickname. This, however, was Barnes' last victory over justice. The Mexican product did not sell as well as Madonna's Marcellus powder. All the members of the council searched day and night for new suppliers, but not all of them were careful. Joseph Hayden claimed to have found a supplier that would solve all the problems. He was Louis D., who, according to Hayden, could get anything from a Sherman tank to a ton of heroin at a fabulously low price. He would be happy to help Barnes, but he was having a little money trouble. So Hayden had decided to disregard the council's rules a little and had already paid him for 2 kilograms of heroin. Nicky was furious. Joseph had a reputation as an irresponsible guy before, but this case had surpassed all the previous ones. He'd gone behind Barnes' back to arrange a major purchase, essentially with the first person he met. Barnes drove himself to the meeting where he was arrested. This happened on the night of March the 15th and 16th, 1977. And it wasn't just Nicky who was arrested. The police also arrested Joseph Hayden, Guy Fisher, who had not yet been sent to serve his time, and several other dealers involved with the council. More than $30 million in cash was also seized. The judge set bail at $300,000, upon payment of which Barnes went at least once to meet with his attorney. After familiarizing himself with the case file, Barnes concluded that Louis D. was a special agent of the DEA, Luis Diaz. Diaz had long been working undercover, posing as a mafia partner, forced to wander from family to family and occasionally dealing drugs. That's how he was able to get in touch with one of Joseph Hayden's associates, and then with Hayden himself. Barnes' associates, eager to prove their usefulness and independence to him, unknowingly gave Diaz many secrets of the organization. Barnes' lawyer, meanwhile, was contacted by the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, Fred Ferretti. The editor informed the lawyer that an article on Mr. Untouchable would be published in a forthcoming issue, and he wanted Nicky to pose as a photographer for the cover. The lawyer replied that with a few months before the trial, his client didn't want to draw too much attention to himself, so he wouldn't pose. The editor politely thanked the lawyer and hung up. But a couple hours later, he was contacted by the publication's executive editor. He said he had a photo of Barnes that was taken the night of his arrest, and so if Barnes refused to pose, he would have to put the police photo on the cover of the New York Times. Barnes decided to agree. Since potential jurors would be reading the magazine, they would not be allowed to see the police station photo. The trial was set to be held in Manhattan, so Nicky decided to dress for the photo shoot so that a juror from Manhattan, a middle-class man, could see him looking like himself. Barnes decided to wear a plain, casual suit of light-colored denim and a red, white, and blue tie. In the photo, he stood in front of the camera and modestly, but with dignity, held his hands in front of him. The Sunday supplement issue of the New York Times Magazine, with Barnes on the cover, was published on June the 5th, 1977. The caption under the photo read, "This is Nicky Barnes. The police say he may be Harlem's biggest drug dealer, but can they prove it?" Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, liked to start his day by reading the latest press. He was impressed by the arrogance he saw in Nicky Barnes' posture. It's rumored that at that moment he uttered the phrase, "If we can't arrest this man, then there is something wrong with our justice system." The U.S. Attorney General received a personal order from the President to take all measures to put Mr. Untouchable behind bars. A few months later, Barnes was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The court went to unprecedented lengths. For the sake of avoiding pressure for justice and for the personal safety of the jury, the verdict was rendered by the first anonymous jury in U.S. history, which consisted of 15 people. Their names, residences, ages, and occupations were kept secret. At first, the council only gave Barnes in prison good news. As time went on, however, rumors began to reach Barnes that the council's affairs had become so bad that Guy Fisher had even abandoned the idea of buying the Apollo Theater. But the bad news didn't end there. During one of their dates, Barnes' wife informed him that she had seen Guy Fisher at a basketball game in the company of Barnes' mistress, Shamika. In the opinion of Barnes' wife, there was something going on between them. This news pissed Nicky off. He had noticed before that Shamika was treating Guy too well, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. The fact was that the rules of the council forbade any relationship between its members and each other's wives or mistresses. Violation of that rule was punishable by death. Without any evidence, Barnes could not accuse Guy directly, so he first decided to ask Shamika herself. She showed up for a prison date and told Barnes that nothing had ever happened between her and Guy. Nicky calmed down for a while. 6 months later, Barnes met a member of Guy Fisher's gang in prison. This guy everyone called JJ. According to JJ, in the 3 years he spent behind bars, Guy never visited him once. JJ also told Barnes a story about his comrade Bob, who was out on parole. The council was supposed to pay Bob $500 for every week he spent in prison, but when Bob demanded the money owed to him, Fisher refused. Bob's misadventures did not end there. It turned out that while he was in prison, his girlfriend became Fisher's mistress. Thanks to a small bribe, Barnes was able to use the phone in the break room. After contacting several subordinates, Nicky learned the true state of affairs. It turned out that most of the heroin suppliers refused to cooperate with the council because Guy Fisher didn't pay them on time. The product of the remaining suppliers was of worse quality, and the small dealers were having problems selling. This news shocked Barnes. He had put a lot of time and effort into building a sterling reputation for his product, and his successors had so botched it up, the council had even stopped paying Nicky's lawyers. Barnes' doubts were finally dispelled by a letter received a month later. In a large envelope were photos of Shamika with Guy at dinner together, as well as during a basketball game. In one picture, Guy was kissing Shamika. The envelope did not have the sender's name on it, but along with the photos, there was still a short note inside. It contained the words, "From the Drug Enforcement Administration." Barnes wasn't initially going to cooperate with the authorities. He had received offers to turn in his associates before, but he has always responded with a firm refusal. Now, when he realized that he would not have to wait for help from the council, he changed his mind. Barnes was driven by a desire to send his former comrades to prison. As one journalist joked, at that moment, Mr. Untouchable turned into Mr. Tell-All You Know. In order to put Guy Fisher and the others behind bars, Barnes decided to stop at nothing and tell all the murders committed by the council. On January the 4th of 1983, Barnes appeared before a grand jury and laid out all the crimes he had committed with the council since 1973. Nicky pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and participating in the decision-making process to commit 4 murders. On March the 10th of that year, Guy Fisher was arrested. In August of 1998, Nicky Barnes, who was already 64 years old, was released from prison. This was due in no small part to the U.S. Attorney General Rudolph Giuliani, who succeeded in getting Barnes' life sentence overturned. Since then, Barnes has been in the Witness Protection Program. He was rumored to be living somewhere in the Midwest. On June the 18th of 2012, Nicky Barnes passed away. The cause of his death was cancer. The information about his death did not hit the media until summer of 2019. The story of Nicky Barnes can hardly be called instructive. Life practically did not give him a chance to choose another non-drug-related path. Mr. Untouchable evokes neither horror nor pity. He was as unique as the Harlem of the 70s, which is a thing of the past.